workers missed 2 paychecks, and more than half of these workers were ordered to work without pay. They protected our skies and made sure that our food was safe to eat. But they struggled to pay their bills, their mortgages, and their medications. I volunteered yesterday at Chef Jose Andres' Chefs for Feds Cafe, which has been providing meals for furloughed federal workers in the Washington area. The shutdown is over, but many workers are unsure where they will get their next meal from because they still haven't received their paychecks. They told me how they are concerned about the long-lasting hits to things like their credit rating, and how they are tired of being used as pawns in the president's political games. So these are public servants. Without them, Social Security benefits would not be delivered, farmers would not receive support, veterans would not be cared for, and airplanes would not be able to safely land. And some of them put their lives on the line to protect our country. They deserve better than what they have gotten during these past several weeks. They deserve a raise. This bill will provide federal civilian workers with a 2.6% pay raise for 2019. It creates parity between pay increases for military and civilian employees, and it makes clear that Congress values their work. The majority is committed to giving them the resources they need to provide for their families. It is the right thing to do. With that, let me turn to my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments that he would like to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in being happy that the government's back open. The House is moving forward on other matters as negotiations over funding bills and border security continue. Throughout my time in Congress, I've been supportive of federal workers and ensuring they receive pay commensurate with important work that they do for the American people. Frankly, this is not just a matter of having a lot of federal workers in my district, which I do. At Tinker Air Force Base, there's over 16,000, another 5,000 at Fort Sill and the National Weather Center, EPA labs, Indian healthcare facilities, you name it. So we have quite a federal presence. But this is something I know a little bit about because my dad did 20 years in the Air Force, then 20 years as a civilian worker at Tinker. My brother followed the same course. So I have considerable sympathy with the bill that my friend is bringing before us today. But the process for bringing the bills forward still needs a lot of work. In our friend's rule package, the Democrats promised to bring only rule bills to the floor if they had gone through a hearing and a markup in the Committee of Jurisdiction. This bill has done neither. And while there's different standard for matters arising during a government shutdown, the expectation is different during normal operations. And the expectation is that bills will come to rules that have gone through the committee hearings and markups. This bill does not have a CBO score, so members have no idea of precisely how much it will cost. The bill, as currently written, does not offset expenditures and does not comply with PAYGO, which the majority included in their rules package. The bill likely will come up under a closed rule, and when the majority took over, they promised a more open process with more amendments being considered on the floor. Since the Democrats have taken over, we've had exactly one structured rule, and the rest have been closed rules. We'd like to see the majority fulfill their promise. I know the chairman's committed to doing that. We're going to work with him on that, but to move toward a more open process in considering the legislation. So that is my major concern here, Mr. Chairman, is process, information in terms of the CBO, adherence to our own rules package. Those sorts of things, I think, would suggest we should slow this process down, go have committee hearings, have an opportunity for members to really understand the full cost of the measure in front of us. And so those are points I'll be making later today. But again, I join the chairman in welcoming our two very good friends here to the committee.
And let me just say to my, thank you, let me just say to my friend from Oklahoma, we are hopefully not only committed, but we will deliver on a better process. I will just say, and it won't satisfy you, but the rules package we passed talked about requiring bills to go through committee hearings and markups as of March 1st, given the fact that we knew we got started late here, and that it would take a while to get some of these committees up and running and constituted. So I know that's a little comfort. I mean, I do really believe that bills should go through committees. They should have hearings. They should have markups, because I think it shows respect for the members of the committee. of jurisdiction. So we want to move that way. And our hope is, to make some germane amendments in order to this. Again, some amendments were submitted that are not germane, but we're hoping to make some germane amendments in order. And so, with that, I'm happy to welcome from the Committee on Oversight and Reform the Honorable Jerry Connolly of Virginia and the Honorable Mark Meadows of North Carolina. We are happy to have you both here. And Mr. Connolly, we will begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Mr. Cole, and members of the committee. I appreciate very much the opportunity to testify today on H.R. 790, the Federal Civilian Workforce Pay Raise Fairness Act of 2019. This bill will end the current pay freeze for federal civilian employees and provide those hardworking public servants with a 2.6% pay increase in 2019. More than 800,000 federal employees just endured the longest government shutdown in American history, 35 days. During that shutdown, many of these individuals reported to work without knowing when or if they would receive their next paycheck, while others were willing to work but were unable to do so because they were furloughed by their agencies. Under statute, federal civilian employees should have received a 2.1% pay increase for 2019. Instead, the administration issued another pay freeze, halting not only the pay raise federal employees were expecting, but also any adjustments to locality pay for employees working in higher cost regions of the country. That's what we're trying to address today. While the House of Representatives passed appropriations bills that ultimately included a 1.9% pay increase for federal employees, that is to say the Senate, the continuing resolution agreed to by the House and Senate on Friday did not address the president's pay freeze, unfortunately. This bill, the one in front of us, would give federal employees a 2.6 pay adjustment equal to the pay increase provided to members of the military for calendar year 2019. Historically, Congress has tried to ensure pay parity between federal civilian employees and their military service member counterparts. I think it's important to remember, let's take a place like the Pentagon, civilian and uniformed employees work side by side, often doing the same work. But one's going to qualify for a 2.6% pay increase, and the other is going to get zero. We believe that's inherently unfair and does not reflect, frankly, the values this Congress wants to convey to our hardworking civilian employees, especially after this shutdown. A federal employee pay increase of 2.6% is further justified by the hardships of recent years. Let's recall, since 2011, federal employees have contributed nearly $200 billion to deficit reduction, the only employee group on the planet asked to do so. They've had to endure government shutdowns, including the longest one in U.S. history, pay freezes, 3 of them, hiring freezes, and lost pay as a result of sequestration-related furloughs. In 9 of the last 10 years, Congress has failed to enact an increase in basic pay for federal employees that matches or exceeds the amount called for in statute. That's not the case for their military counterparts. In 8 of those last 10 years, basic pay increases have trailed increases in the cost of living for our civilian employees. We must have a talented and dedicated federal workforce carrying out the complex and vital missions of the federal government. That's particularly true given the fact that somewhere between 30 and 40% of the existing federal civilian workforce is eligible for retirement over the next 4 to 5 years. How will we recruit their replacements? How do you go to a campus today and say, with a straight face, I see a 30-year career, federal career in your future, under these circumstances? We have to turn that around. The men and women who inspect the airplanes we fly on, or who go abroad to support diplomatic and military missions, who serve in federal law enforcement, including at the border, to keep us safe, who ensure that our food and drug supplies are ready for human consumption. Those are all the tasks civilian federal employees engage in to protect the public safety and health of the people we represent. This bill is supported by the American Federation of Government Employees, the National Treasury Employees Union, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, the National Active and Retired Federal Employees, the Federal Managers Association, among others. I urge the committee to adopt the rule for H.R. 790. Chairman Cummings has submitted a manager's amendment that makes a few technical corrections to the bill, and I support those corrections. I understand members have submitted amendments as well, as Chairman McGovern indicated, to ensure that pay increases will apply to all employees of the IRS, NASA, the Secret Service, as well as those individuals at the Department of Defense who did not receive a pay raise when members of the military received their pay raise for calendar 2019. I urge the committee to make those amendments also in order. The bottom line, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, is that more than 900,000 federal employees make less than $60,000 a year. Federal employees have families to care for and bills to pay. We saw the hardship in this 35-day shutdown, breaking apart, I think, the stereotype that all of our federal employees are living at very high level salaries and compensation. Not true. Also not true. All of these federal employees pretty much live within the Beltway. 85% of all federal employees live outside the Beltway. And as Mr. Cole indicated, many of them are in districts such as his, performing very important tasks that are valued by this country. We need to express that value. So I urge adoption of this bill and the amendments Chairman McGovern has referred to. Happy to answer any questions. And I thank the committee in advance for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. Welcome.
Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, all the members of the committee, thank you so much for allowing me to testify on H.R. 790, the Federal Civilian Workforce Pay Raise Fairness Act. That's a mouthful, of 2019. I thank the gentleman to my right. It's one of the first times that he's ever been to my right. He is truly a good friend, and I say that. And so anything that I bring before the committee's consideration today is not meant to be a personal attack on my good friend from Virginia, as much as it is to hopefully illuminate the facts that are before us today. You know, we're talking about a pay freeze, and you would think that the emergency situation that we have here, the way that this bill was introduced, the way that it's being brought before this committee, the fact that there have been no markups, the fact that we actually had a committee hearing today and we're organized, we're ready to go, and somehow we've had a rush to put this thing on the floor, would lead many of us to believe that this is nothing more than a messaging bill and not serious about trying to make real reforms to the federal workforce. My good friend from Virginia knows well that I have actually been in a number of our federal agencies, and I find it deplorable that many times I'm the first member of Congress to have ever visited an agency, a federal agency here and around Washington, D.C. We must all do a better job of doing that and showing true appreciation to our federal workforce. But that being said, this across-the-board 2.6 fails to hit the target. It fails to hit the bullseye. I mean, and this is not the first pay freeze that we've had. Actually, we had 3 under President Obama. I mean, when you look at pay freezes, all of a sudden what we have here is a rush to try to send a message that Republicans are awful to federal workers and Democrats are not. Now, we have 1.8 million federal civilian employees that need to be fairly compensated. And as we look at this, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office, their analysis of federal employees, and they find that they're better compensated than their private sector counterparts. Now, that is certainly not news to many of you, but when we look at those with a high school education, some 52%, they make 52% more than their private sector counterparts. Now, granted, there are some that are grossly underpaid. I think the gentleman from Virginia knows me well enough. in a bipartisan way. I've been wanting to look at federal pay, and hopefully we can come back before this committee where we're truly addressing the problem. But today, this bill does not address that problem. This bill, honestly, has been rushed. It does not have a CBO score, as the ranking member Cole had put it. Could cost some $50 billion, but I think, you know, here's where we look at this. The new rules promise to, and I want to quote, require bills to go through the Rules Committee to have a hearing and a markup before they go to the floor, unquote. And yet here we are today with no legislative hearing, no markup. I want to also go a little bit further. It is this bill that was introduced on Friday, now here at the Rules Committee for consideration by the entire House on the floor, that imparts a federal pay raise. But more importantly, it starts to break the very promises that so many of us came together and the majority promised to the minority less than 30 days ago. Here we were saying that we're going to have a process that would actually work towards bringing us together, not separating. But it doesn't stop there. You can look at a resolution, I guess the resolution that was entered and added to the floor schedule just last night. Congresswoman Wexton introduced a resolution alleging that the president failed to go through the regular order of the appropriations process and placing the entire blame of the shutdown on the president. Now, I find it interesting that here we are today talking about the president not going through regular order when indeed we're not going through regular order. It's the height of hypocrisy to make that kind of mention. So I'm all about bipartisan solutions, especially coming out of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, where we've got Mr. Raskin that sits on this committee, Mr. Connolly to my right. I'm willing to work with you. This bill neither fixes the hardships that they're facing nor adjusts reforms in a meaningful way in a long-term basis. I would urge you to a no vote on this particular rule, and certainly stand ready for any questions. And I thank the chairman.
Well, thank you both for your testimony. I don't have any questions. I just again want to point out for the record that the rules that we put forward said that we would insist that bills go through, have committee hearings and markups as of March 1st. So as far as I know, this bill was posted 72 hours ago. So as far as this committee is concerned, we are complying with the rules. I don't know what goes on in your committee or with the whether there was time to do this or not, but I wanted the record to reflect.
Mr. Chairman, I think it is important to note that our committee just got organized today.
Yeah. So I mean, that's I appreciate it, and after March 1st, if we're doing this, please feel free to come and yell at me. I'm sure these guys will.
Well, I would respectfully
yell at me, right? I know you as you always do. But and I just want to insert in the record a Washington Post piece that says federal employees lag behind private sector workers in salaries by 32% on average, according to a recent report. I'll insert that in the record. I don't have any questions. Ms. Torres, do you have any questions or comments?
I actually do have some comments. I guess a little bit disappointed that we can't do this bill and this amendment on a bipartisan way. And the reason why I say that, Mr. Meadows, is because I know that you've talked to displaced workers that were furloughed during the shutdown. So I know that you know how difficult life has been for them in the last 35 days. So we agree on that. You also know that there was a pay freeze last year for them. In my opinion, we should be arguing about doubling the 2.6 instead of whether they should get a 2.6. I absolutely agree that there are times in need that we need to freeze salaries. I agree with that 100%. I'm from California, and I've had to deal with a 6-month shutdown. We had to reduce the state government by 1/3. I know how it is to make those very, very tough decisions. It's not easy. But I also know how those really, really tough decisions can impact our workforce. We don't have a downturn in the economy right now as we did in the past. As a matter of fact, according to President Trump, we're looking really good and everybody's winning. The economy is looking really good. So if the economy is looking really good for the 1%, we should try to figure out how to make that 99% a little better. I want to tell you about an experience that I had at Ontario Airport on Friday when I visited with furloughed workers. I talked to a worker who was in the process of purchasing a home. In California, it's really tough to even get into this bid process, right? You're outbid from right under, and if you're trying to qualify for an FHA loan, it's extremely difficult to even find a property that would be financed through an FHA loan. This young couple went through all that. They had just adopted a young girl, and they got caught up. They went, going through the process of trying to simply verify their employment. Couldn't get that done because the agency was shut down. They couldn't get a loan from their credit union because, as you know, when you're going through escrow, you can't show more debt than what you currently show, or you won't close escrow. You can't afford to be late on payments because that's a negative. Anything that you do during that 30-day process will result in your credit score being lowered, and it would be a negative impact on closing escrow. So it's a very, very difficult time for them. Having to employ or try to recruit employees into some of our departments is very difficult already as it is because we are not the top paying employer. Some of our agencies are incredibly frustrated in trying to maintain that talent. We will see the impact of the shutdown in the next 10 years because a lot of talented individuals, that historical knowledge we will have lost because they're going to go somewhere else if they haven't already left. So we're having to deal with that. A 2.6 increase, I think it's the bottom of the barrel that we can offer. Since we're not offering them any interest on their lost pay, most financial institutions would only give them a 14-day loan. That's why we saw the food banks. That's why we saw all of those other things, the assistance that they needed, because they couldn't sustain themselves for 35 days. I'm really hoping that, through this, we can work together and really look at our workforce. We need to appreciate them for the great job that they do. And I don't think that we want to come across the shutdown as uncaring about our own employees. I think we have to show them that we do care about them and that we stand together in solidarity with them, and that last year's pay freeze was unfortunate. We don't have an economic crisis, so there is really no reason for us to do that, other than we want to find something to argue about. I don't think that this is it. I fully support this amendment. I fully support this bill. I wish it was higher than 2.6%, but I think that this is the beginning of reaching out to our employees, and it's a good faith of showing them that we care about them and we want them to stay. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions. And again, I say this as somebody that has considerable sympathy with what my friend is trying to accomplish, but how long would it have taken to get a CBO score? I mean, to me, it's pretty basic. We should know what something costs if we're going to vote on it.
Mr. Cole, we have got an indication from CBO that the total cost of this bill on an annual basis would be $6 billion, and prorated from whenever we enacted, probably $5.5 billion. But remember, if you were to follow the statutory guideline of the increase they're entitled to, that's 2.1%. So this only would add 0.5, and so the actual net cost would be considerably below that. It's nowhere near what my friend suggested, $50 billion a year. They didn't have time to give a full scoring of it, but that's roughly the estimate.
Well, I'm not in a position to debate. I would just like to see it.
Well, with your permission, to my good friend's point, it's his numbers that I'm quoting. It's actually 5.5 billion to 6 billion annually, and so over a 10-year period, it's $50 billion. So I mean, you can't look at it any other way. It's real great to try to take CBO and suggest that we can take this part out. And listen, there's been no one, I've been before this committee, being very critical of CBO. But I find it interesting that we're going to use CBO's excuse of not scoring this when they were able to score the impact of the shutdown the day that the shutdown ended. Maybe it's some misplaced guidance on their part where they could have looked at the gentleman from Virginia's bill, but with that being said, the cost is close to $60 billion over 10 years.
Second question, if I may. Well, excuse me.
I was just going to say, in a friendly spirit, I'm delighted to learn of this newfound concern of my friend from North Carolina, who had no such concern when he voted for a tax cut bill that added $190 billion a year to the deficit. And you want 10 years? That's $1.9 trillion.
The next question I would have is any of this offset in any way? Is there any, and I ask that as an appropriator because we're going to get a magic number at some point. And so if we're going to increase the salary, I mean, tell me what in each individual bill we're going to cut if we're going to stay within that number. I mean, that's what really bothers me here is process because appropriators will have to make that decision. We're the only ones that actually really live within a number. And when that number gets spit out, I mean, if for some reason, let's say it didn't increase this year, tell me if it's coming out of early childhood, is it coming out of TRIO money? I mean, that's what bothers me. This just seems to be awfully precipitous without a lot of committee work. And why couldn't there have been a hearing or two so these questions could have been raised and may well have satisfactory answers to every one of them?
Well, Mr. Cole, let me just say, the issue of pay parity is not new for me. I have been an advocate, as have many of us here in Congress on both sides of the aisle, an advocate for pay parity since we got here. And I will remind colleagues that for the 8 years of the Obama administration, pretty much we adhered to pay parity. All of a sudden, in the last 2 years, we're not doing that. The net cost of this bill is not that great if you assume that Congress actually acted on the statutory recommendation, which is 2.1%. So the delta here is 0.5. And frankly, the costs are not that great. And so, yeah, we can find some offset for whatever that works out to be. It's somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion in your costing. It is true that we, on our side of the aisle, decided this was of such an importance, and I think Ms. Torres captured that spirit. We just had the worst, longest shutdown in American history. It was a terribly demeaning and demoralizing thing for federal employees, and it's going to have lasting effects. What can Congress do to try to start to restore confidence in the federal government, and for us to make a statement, to our own workforce that they are respected? And we thought pay parity was sort of a minimal way of, frankly, expressing that. And that's in the spirit in which we're operating.
Has the Senate acted on this at all?
I don't believe they have, sir, but I believe that they're going to be considering it.
Okay, so there'll be a negotiated process in front of us. This is essentially the House position.
Yes, sir.
Obviously, to get into law, it'd have to get through the Senate, would have to be signed by the President.
That's right.
Okay. Very good. Well, I thank the gentleman and thank both of them for their good work, and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anyone on our side? Ms. Matsui?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of comments. You know, I have federal employees in my district, and about 12,000 of them, and they rarely complain. They're rarely, you know, I see them at the airport, the TSA workers. I know they don't get paid much, but they're always great, friendly, and they do their job. I have Coast Guard in my district also, who are very proud people. And I started getting some calls from a lot of them who never had to reach out in any way. They just wanted to have someone listen to them, in essence. And so when some of these individuals had to, and a lot of them were like their spouses that called and said, I'm in real trouble. Our family's in real trouble. Never had this before. I actually have to go to food bank. And, you know, like they've never had to do anything like that before. And the anxiety of not knowing when this was going to end. And the fact is that not everybody has an extra $100 or $200 to tide them through. And to me, this isn't the way we feel about a community. And federal employees are part of our community. And they do so much, and I think we realize that. You know, they really, you know, what do we do without our Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, people who inspect our food, our drugs, you know, our water, our medicine, everything. So you realize how it trickles down throughout the communities, and I think it had gone on for even a week more, we would have really felt it in a very, very, very negative way. But these federal employees have dedicated their lives and their careers in service to the American people, and they stood up and they said, you know, we're here. And they knew that, and I think there was a greater appreciation for them also going to work without pay. And, you know, I'm looking at this thing and I see, at the very least, okay, you know, during the Trump shutdown, they missed 2 paychecks. That's a lot of money. And just even think about, you know, a regular middle-class family to miss 1 paycheck. I mean, everybody sort of budgets. I think most people budget, you know. They know how much of the car payments are, the house payments, and things like that. But to miss 2 paychecks, right? And, you know, when you think about the fact that over half of these people were ordered back to work without pay to protect our skies and ensure our food is safe to eat, and they were having difficulties making their payments, and yes, they came to work. And I think about the fact that they had to actually go to the food banks and ask their neighbors. And I would tell you, it was really amazing the people who came out, went to the airports, they brought food, they brought their produce, and it was like, we're in this, and we appreciate what you do. That was wonderful. But they still need to work. They need to have their paychecks. And in a sense, I think they felt like we didn't appreciate them. And that is really unfortunate. So, you know, after 35 days, they finally got their paycheck. They returned back to work. But, you know, we really have to do something. And I think Ms. Torres was saying it. In this economy, a lot of these people are sort of looking to see if maybe there are other things they could be doing. And a lot of these people have expertise that we need in the federal government. And if we're looking at the sustainability of this government, we need to retain these people. They are very important to us. So this is, I mean, this raise is it's parity. I mean, to get them out of the military, right? But if we don't do this, it's just another slap in their face, I believe. And so, and it's also not just about our current workforce. The fact that this shutdown occurred and lasted so long, I think people are beginning to feel really, really emotionally dejected and feel like maybe perhaps our government is not working the way it should work, which is really, really unfortunate. So we need to guarantee that our federal workforce have the resources to provide for their families. I'm really pleased to support this legislation. I believe it's a necessity, and it's an important affirmation of our appreciation for these federal employees that are so very necessary to all of us. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I just want to, again, point out for the record that, you know, I was at Chef Andre's Chefs for Feds Cafe yesterday, and even though the government shutdown is over with, people still haven't received their paychecks. So the line for food and other supplies was still huge. So, and people did not know when exactly the day would come when that paycheck will be there. So, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're talking very little about H.R. 790 and a whole lot about the government shutdown. I would ask the committee chairman, are we only doing this bill because there was a government shutdown, or would this have been a good idea anyway, irrespective of, I'm sorry, not the chairman, I'll ask our representative, Mr. Connolly.
Actually,
I was prepared to promote you, right there. Don't tell Mr. Cummings.
Actually, no, I do have that title. Mark and I switched. I have favored pay parity every year. During the Obama years, we didn't need legislation because he honored pay parity. So we would have probably introduced this bill at some appropriate time. Ms. Torres talked about she'd like it to be even more. Every year I introduce a bill called the FAIR Act that recalibrates what we think federal employees ought to be getting. And that number last year, that percentage last year would have been 3.2%. So this is targeted solely to what is being recommended for the military side of the workforce, and let's do the same for the civilian side. It is, as I said earlier, Mr. Woodall, if you look at what we otherwise would do by statute, the federal civilian workforce is entitled under statute to 2.1% increase. The president has recommended reversing that to 0. If you assume for a minute the 2.1, what our bill does really is only add 0.5 to it. And that's why the net cost, if you look at it that way, is really not that great. But if you want to say, no, it's 0 to 2.6, then the total net cost is somewhere between $5 and $6 billion this year.
So your support is simply whatever Congress does for the military, you want that same thing to happen. That has been your historical support.
It has been a long-standing principle of federal employee groups and many of us here in Congress that pay parity is something very important in the workforce for lots of reasons, many of which have already been cited.
And so if I might comment on that, while the name pay parity sounds great, what he's talking about is parity with the percentage increase. It's not pay parity. I want to make that clear. Federal workforce have a variety of pay levels that grossly outpace our military men and women. And I want to make that very clear. To suggest that our military men and women at 2.6 are getting parity, even if this bill passed with the federal workforce, is simply just not the case. And we're talking about a pay freeze. It's also important, only in Washington, D.C. does a pay freeze not really mean a pay freeze. They get step increases within grade, and so when we look at that, you look at over 50% of every federal workforce has gotten a pay increase within the grade consistently for the last decade.
Now, while most of the conversation has been about the shutdown, I want to talk about some of the important principles that I think we do share, like retention.
Right.
It is true that as we turn on the news, we hear federal employees talking about what the shutdown has meant to them and what it means to the future. I know there has not been a hearing or a markup here, but
Mr. Woodall, would you allow me just to add a little bit to the record from what my friend just said to you?
Well, let me finish. Let me finish my question. I'd be happy.
Well, this was part of that answer.
Well, I meant the one that I'm asking. The one that I'm asking right now.
Now, okay.
Is there anything in 790 that is designed to address our shared retention needs, other than an across the board increase?
we believe that's a vital part of beginning to try to restore the damage done.
But just a part. You believe it's a vital part,
Yeah,
but only a part.
That's right. This bill is not, doesn't address
It's
all
not
of the...
focused on,
Right.
but
Because we have a lot more work to do, obviously, on recruitment and retention, especially for millennials. But if you don't start to address compensation in a way that sends a signal to the civilian workforce, both current and prospective, that they will be honored and dignified for their work, you're never going to get to the issue of recruitment and retention.
I know that is true. The CDC is in my part of
That's right.
the world, and yes, one of those professionals walks out of the door, I can't just go hire another one tomorrow. These are folks with unique skill sets and a unique love of not just this country, but the entire human race that they dedicate themselves to serving. And I'm 100%, even as a fiscal conservative, in favor of dealing with real pay parity issues to say, listen, if you can go to work for Merck down the road and I'm trying to keep you in the federal government, what are my retention tools available? I don't see any targeting in this bill at all. It is true that there are contract jobs in the government, jobs that are easily contracted in the government. There is a difference. In the same way there's a difference between the military workforce and the civilian workforce. There's a difference in some of these skill sets that we really can't afford to have walk out the door, and some of these skill sets that are more interchangeable and we can easily recruit to fill those spots. Statute required for 2.1, you're pushing for 2.6. You say it's not a lot of money, maybe only $1 billion. I know that's a big number writ in towns other than D.C., but it's $1 billion we could put towards retention of some of these PhD professionals, retention and training of some of the folks in these mid-level jobs. Is it clear to you that we can only spend this $500 million to $1 billion, as you termed it once? Is it your position as someone who's long fought for federal employees and their dignity and the improvement of the recognition of their service, that spending the $500 million to $1 billion on the 0.5% above what the statute provides for is better than spending that billion on some of these other things that you acknowledge the committee is going to be working on down the road for retention and recruitment and professional development?
It is a way of Congress. It's ready at hand, a way for Congress to express itself after what we just went through, which gives it a certain poignancy and compelling nature that otherwise maybe, would be a routine public policy thing we address or don't. But it most certainly is, I think, essential, Mr. Woodall, to sort of anchor the hemorrhaging we're now going to be experiencing in terms of people going out the door. One of the consequences of this kind of disrespect, whether intended or not, the shutdown, is that a lot of people in your district and my district who are senior and ready to retire, who've been holding on because they're committed public servants, have finally decided, I've had it. The spouse won't let me do it anymore, I'm out of here. How do we replace that scientist or that researcher? And what's at stake if that job stays open for too long? You know better than I what's at stake. And many of us have facilities like that, I know Mr. Cole does, that these are critical. And by the way, they're not easy to replace. And most of them could make a lot more money in the private sector at the higher skill set. My friend cited an average number, and it is true that at the lower end of the skill set, generally the federal compensation is a little bit better than the private sector. But at the higher end of the skill set, believe me, if you're an engineer, a technician, a technologist, a lawyer, a doctor, you're going to make more money in the private sector than you're going to make for the federal government. So there's a certain dedication as a public servant. So showing respect, to me, is the beginning of how we start to restore what has been damaged.
I know you're sincere in that, and I hear you say that there's more to come from the committee. I know that that what you say has that grain of truth. The problems I see in retention are not going to be solved by 2.6% one-time pay raise, and the respect that the senior people that I serve ask for is something far more than the right words at the right time, and something that looks like perhaps the first serious look at the civil service system that we have seen in decades. And the votes are there to do whatever the new majority wants to do. I hope this won't. I hope this will, in fact, only be the very first sentence of the conversation, and will not substitute for the what we all know is very serious work that needs to come down the road. Mr. Meadows?
The gentleman is correct, and when we look at employee satisfaction, there is a big part of this that this bill does not address. I will say, in my good friend from Virginia's defense, there are areas that have to be addressed in civil service reform. But when you have 25% of federal workers saying that they do not believe that people get raises based on merit, that's a problem. When you have over 33% of federal workers saying that they don't believe enough is being done to address poor performance and that they're getting treated unfairly, that's a problem. And that's why when you do it across the board, it reinforces the poor performers along with the exceptional performers, and we've got to do something about it, and I appreciate the gentleman's pointing that out.
I look forward to the future work of the committee. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Did you had something else to add? At the end?
You
Yeah.
got it. Reclaiming my
Well,
time, Mr. Chairman. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Mr. Connolly,
Thank you. I just wanted to read, because my friend from North Carolina would have you believe that pay parity, well, that the military don't have the same step increases. Of course, military do have promotion schedules that do include pay increases. But let me just read to you the gap. This is not new this year between basic pay raise for civilian and what the military got over the last 10 years. So this year, military get 2.6, civilian gets 0. Last year, military got 2.4. Basic pay raise for civilian, 1.4. The previous year, 2.1 for military, 1 for civilian. In 2016, 1.3 for military, 1 for civilian, and so on. The gap has gone on for 10 years. Cumulatively, that has an impact. And so, you know, we're trying to address that, and we're trying to address the morale. And as I said, we don't pretend 2.6% somehow solves all of our problems. But we got to start somewhere. And I think it's incumbent upon Congress, having failed to keep government open, to start to help make that right. And we have right in front of us a simple vehicle through pay parity that would send, I think, a very important positive message and some practical dollars in pockets to help restore what has been damaged.
Because the message is important. I know you can just ask any of your federal judge friends about what the impact of 10 years' worth of no pay raises are, and they will share with you, and you can compare to see what that is. My experience is it's not particularly effective to say, hey, I'm not keeping up with the Joneses. What's more effective is to say, if you're proud of what the Joneses are doing, let me show you what I'm doing on your behalf. And I regret, because these past 10 years, I promise you, have been less kind to the servicemen and women in my district than they have to so many of the federal agency employees in my district. To say that our best argument is that because our men and women in military are sacrificing so much and serving us so well, we should be where they are, probably is not our most effective tact. To say that we are so very, very proud of them and we're going to be sure that you're just as proud of us, I would argue would be a more effective message for my bosses back home.
If the gentleman from Georgia would indulge for just a second, the gentleman from Virginia is actually comparing apples to oranges. He's talking about pay scale increases and the percentage that those have gone up, not salaries. And I can tell you, if you look at the data from OPM with salaries, the federal workforce that are outside of DOD get treated in a much more generous fashion, even historically, than our military men and women. So when we talk about pay equity and parity, we need to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples.
I understand there are a lot more GS-15s than there used to be, and a lot more stars at the Pentagon than there used to be as well. I'm looking for that analysis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Promodio?
And I want to thank the gentleman for coming to speak to us today. And particularly, Mr. Meadows, I want to thank you for some positive comments about reopening the government last week. And, you know, I've said to Mr. Connolly, I have what's called a federal center in my district. So we are second only to Washington, D.C. in the concentration of the number of federal employees. And we have every agency you can think of, all the intelligence agencies, the Secretary of State, Bureau of Land Management, USGS, all that stuff. And it's clear to me that the patriotism of these employees is second to none. Military, doesn't matter to me.
I agree.
I mean, they are prepared to sacrifice on behalf of all of us. And they take a hit in pay. And so on this committee, we've been dealing with, you know, appropriation after appropriation. And I'm glad, I'd say to my friend Mr. Cole, I hope he's in the middle of making sure that we don't have another shutdown. And I've urged him on several occasions now to be part of that conversation, because I think he can play a very powerful role. Now, to my questions to you two, just so I got it. So the law today, Mr. Connolly, is that the employees, federal employees, are entitled to a 2.1% increase.
The statutory formula would say 2.1.
Okay. And on what date did the president freeze their pay?
In his budget, he recommended a pay freeze.
Has that pay been frozen
Well,
at current levels without the 2.1%?
pretty much so, because given what happened here on the Hill, there was a 1.9% pay increase across the board recommended coming out of the Senate. We did not have that in the House. So it was going to go to conference, and the hope was we would recede to the Senate. December 28th being the president's?
That was your staff. I thought it was for me.
December 28th, Liberation Day. So, and then because of the shutdown and all that got affected. So that's why we're here talking about pay parity and 2.6%.
Okay. And I guess this goes to you and maybe even to Mr. Cole. The 2.1%, I mean, has that been appropriated? Has it been obligated as part of, or it's still in limbo because we never closed the loop on all the appropriations? Okay.
The Appropriations Committee, Mr. Cole, if I got this correct, the Appropriations Committee in the Senate recommended 1.9.
I think 1.4, but I'm not sure. So
Okay. Yeah, but it wasn't 2.1 to your question.
Okay. So I'd ask Mr. Meadows, and I understand your argument, as Mr. Cole made the argument that, wait, we didn't go through regular order, we don't know if this is the right thing, but the appropriators obviously have been talking about what a pay raise should be for employees. It's not your testimony, is it, that they should get a 0% pay raise?
Well, I haven't weighed in on that particular question, but since you raised it, I obviously will weigh in on it. I can tell you that where we are at this particular juncture, if we're looking at federal pay or salary increases, the step increases that are available to every federal employee within schedule, out of 1.4 million federal employees that are covered under the GS schedule. This does not include SES. There's less than 30,000 of them who have maxed out at the top level of a GS-15. And so when you look at that, to suggest that they're not getting pay increases, it's just not, it's not accurate. That on top of this would actually, with the 2.6% that the gentleman from Virginia is recommending, in addition to the step increases they would get, would actually put them at a level much higher than our military men and women have received.
But not everybody gets a step increase. at the same
Well,
time?
53% of them get it every year,
And
that is
a merit increase, or is that considered a longevity, just a service increase?
not a merit, so it's not moving from GS to GS. So it's not moving from GS 12 to GS 13. That's within the pay schedule. 52% will get it. And this has been consistent for the last decade. The following year, 52 to 53%. So a lot of times they have to be in schedule for 52 weeks, and so as they work through that, that's where that is.
For the 48%, would you give them a pay increase, or you're at zero for them?
Well, I think it needs to be part of a more comprehensive. Actually, I've been one of the few, in fact, maybe the only Freedom Caucus member, but certainly one of the few Republicans that have advocated in a bipartisan way for us to look at salary increases based on merit and job level, for retention and a variety of other reasons. But it has to be more than just an across-the-board increase. We're actually exacerbating the poor performers, because 30% of the poor performers will get the same raise under the gentleman's bill as everybody else. And so we have to do something, and if not now, when? We're 40 years into the civil service.
And I hear you, and I'm, we could have a long conversation.
You must be an
about this,
attorney.
obviously. So 70%, though. So here's the bottom line. I agree that any big organization.
I'm willing to look at increases for our federal workforce if it's part of a more
comprehensive. No raise, never, no how, no way.
In fact, I'm on record for that, and I will reiterate that today. But it has to be part of a more comprehensive look at our federal workforce to make sure that retention that the gentleman's talking about and fair compensation, because if you look at 6 weeks is the lifespan of a pay increase, 6 weeks. After that, it becomes a demotivator. There's been lots of studies on that. We need to make sure that the other things that keep our federal workforce happy gets addressed along with it.
Mr. Perlmutter? I remind the committee that 900,000 federal employees out of the total earn $60,000 or less. These are not people living high on the hog. And, with all due respect, the logic of my friend's argument would have you never, ever give an across-the-board raise because it's a disincentive, although apparently it isn't on the military side. And that would be...
And it's done in the private sector all the time.
That's right. And that would be a new way of doing business, and maybe it is a better way of doing business. But I will tell you, for a crowd that can't keep government open, what do you think our chances are of overhauling the civil service system on a bipartisan basis in a way that would be efficacious? And all we're trying to do right now is help the existing civilian workforce feel whole again a little bit. And that's what we're trying to do here.
And I want to thank both of you. And I appreciate the comments on the need for the civil service so that we do get good people and retain them for a long time. But there, in my opinion, has to be a statement on the behalf of us and the federal government that, you know what, we appreciate what you've been doing. We think you're patriots. And we're going to give you a 2.6% raise because we've been treating you like junk. And I appreciate the gentleman from Virginia bringing this, and I thank you for your positive comments to get the government open. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been several statements that we need to show that we care about our federal employees, and I want to assure you that Republicans also care about our federal employees. In fact, I'd like to remind you that probably, I know I did, and I assume the 4 of us voted 3 times in the last 3 weeks to pay the federal employees during the shutdown, but it didn't pass on the floor. The question I have is actually for Mr. Meadows, and in one of the comments that the chairman, Mr. McGovern, said that the Washington Post had an article saying that federal workers, I think he said, pay legs private sector by 30%.
32.
32%. Yet I have some the CBO had a report which said federal employees on average received a combined 17% higher wage and benefits package than does the private sector. Do you have any information on this, Mr. Meadows?
The gentlewoman is correct. If you're quoting, CBO did a study on salaries really from 2011 to 2015 to look at that. I think the article that the chairman is referring to is from Joe Davidson, I believe. Is he the author of that article?
Eric Yoder.
Okay. And so what we see in terms of compensation, the CBO, and this is not my numbers, it's their numbers, indicated that those with a high school diploma or less in education received 53% more compensation than their private sector counterparts. The total compensation for workers with professional degrees, doctorates, et cetera, were generally 18% lower for federal employees. So it gets to the point that he's talking about. But for those with bachelor degrees, 21% higher than their private sector counterparts. And so when you look at those are numbers that are not 1 year, they're over a series of years, where you see that the federal employees at certain levels are getting compensated much higher. The retention at some of those higher levels certainly would indicate, there are other studies that would indicate that professionals, engineers, doctors, et cetera, at the federal level get a 6% bump versus their private sector counterparts. We can go back and forth, but I think it demonstrates the need to get back to Mr. Woodall's point, is let's look at this where we can keep retention. I, for one, do not want to see a huge turnover in federal workforce, and think that proper compensation and making sure that it's competitive in the private sector arena is certainly appropriate.
Ms. Lesko?
And thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to, I'm sorry, sir. Just wanted to comment that it does also concern me, Mr. Cole brought it up, that the CPO, we were told, isn't even going to score this because it didn't get out of committee. So that is a little disconcerting that we don't even know how much it was going to cost.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Mr. Connolly, you were going to say something?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Lesko. We've been talking about apples and oranges, and comparisons between the private sector and the federal government often, in many ways, are apples and oranges because of the different complexity of the workforce. The national, the statistic I think Mr. McGovern cited in the Washington Post, actually the origin of that, I believe, is the National Salary Council, right, which includes Trump appointees, right? It's not a partisan thing. And they found, as the chairman indicated, that federal employee salaries on average lag behind by 31%. Now, why would that be true? So 36% of federal employees work in professional occupations, only 20% in the private sector. 24% of private sector employees work in occupations like sales, productions, and construction, only 5% in the public sector in the federal government. And 60% of the federal workforce has at least a bachelor's degree or better, only 35% in the private sector. So there are built-in reasons why there could be bulges or below bulges, if I can put it that way, in terms of compensation, depending on the nature of the work and your education level. And basically, you have a much more diverse workforce in terms of nature of work in the private sector than you do in the federal government. And you also have a less educated workforce overall in the private sector than you do in the federal government.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Chairman, so then I do agree with, I think that proves the point of Mr. Woodall, actually, that maybe we should look at this not just across the board type raise, but actually giving raises to people where they're not as competitive, where the federal workers get paid less than the private sector in some areas. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Connolly for bringing forward the Federal Civilian Workforce Pay Raise Fairness Act, which I'm a proud co-sponsor of, along with, I think, all the other members of the local delegation. As Mr. Connolly observed, 85% of the federal workforce does not live in the National Capital Region, but of course we have a high concentration of workers who do, and I have over 50,000 federal workers in my district who have been demoralized and aggrieved and injured by the government shutdown. And I could not agree more, not just with the substance of the legislation that Mr. Connolly's advancing, but with the timing of it, because we have a federal workforce which is not only underpaid, as the Federal Salary Council demonstrated through Labor Department data studying 250 categories of occupation across the public and private sectors, but we have a federal workforce that has been demoralized and in some sense humiliated by what President Trump just did. And one thing I did want to answer my good friend Mr. Meadows about, just on behalf of Congresswoman Wexton, I don't know exactly what she said on the floor, but she didn't need to blame the shutdown on President Trump. President Trump blamed the shutdown on President Trump. He proudly owned it. He said, it will be the Trump shutdown, and I will not blame it on anybody else. So if she attributed it to Donald Trump, she was following the president in doing that. But that's a digression, and I'm happy to have you answer me when I'm finished about that. But that's just one thing I wanted to point out. But the federal workforce has been taking hits from January of 2017, when the president began with a hiring freeze and then proceeded with a pay freeze and then various proposed cuts to people's pay and their benefits. Of course, the original political philosopher of the administration, Steve Bannon, said that the overriding aim of the administration was the deconstruction of the administrative state, by which he meant my constituents who work at the EPA on clean water, or at NOAA on climate change, or at the FDA trying to rid our food supply of E. coli and salmonella and insect infestation, or the doctors and the researchers at NIH who are working on breast cancer and colon cancer and cystic fibrosis and multiple sclerosis and you name it, malignant narcissistic personality disorder, for that matter. I mean, there's lots of things that are going on at NIH that relate to the American people. So our people have been hurt by this shutdown, and they were underpaid as it was before it all started. So I think Mr. Woodall asks the correct question. Would we be doing this anyway? Of course we would be doing it. At least I certainly would be supporting it. But I think that the urgency of the legislation is underscored by virtue of what just took place. Let me ask each of you a question, if I could. And Mr. Meadows, please feel free to respond about
that's all right.
Congresswoman Wexton. But I wanted to ask you, do you have legislation, or did you have legislation to accomplish what you've been talking about, that is targeting what you think are the most deserving federal employees, or those who are most at risk of leaving because they're severely underpaid?
Yeah, in the previous Congresses, yes, we've actually worked in a bipartisan way on that particular issue, not just specifically in terms of pay increases, but looking at merit pay, which actually can be a very negative word in the federal workforce realm. The way it's intended for me is that making sure that people that have a particular job get paid according to their abilities and their productivity, without a whole lot of what I would say discretion with certain biases that could be entertained. And so it's a much more common. I was a private sector guy. You know, when you look at giving pay raises, you can look at that with some degree of ability to try to pick and make sure your performers are being well compensated. So yes, we've done that. We've also worked on a number of things in terms of federal employee satisfaction surveys. One of the areas where we agree is changing that, and it's been recently that they've talked about changing the benchmarks. I have a problem with that. If you've got a benchmark that has been going on for 8 years, don't change it now so that you can change the curve and make sure that things look better or worse in a particular area. So we've been working in a bipartisan way, and that's why I started my testimony today that while we may disagree on the merits of this particular legislation, it is not a disagreement in totality in terms of what we need to do, how.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and I think that nothing that, you know, without regard to what happens to this legislation, we should continue those explorations of what can be done to build the best incentives in the program. I do have a question for you too, Mr. Connolly.
But could I just add?
Please.
Because I want to validate what my friend said. We're not going to agree on this bill, and our disagreement is going to be vigorous. But having said that, Mr. Meadows and I have worked together. He is the chairman, I is the ranking member, and we're just going to flip this year. I have never found Mr. Meadows to be anything but thoughtful and sympathetic to the challenges we face in the federal workforce and with federal employees themselves. He has not taken some kind of, ideologically hostile approach to the people, especially you and I represent. And I very much appreciate that, because that thoughtfulness can infuse debate and lead to prudent legislation. And so I look forward to working with Mr. Meadows, despite this bill, as we move forward over the
And I appreciate that very much, too, as the representative of tens of thousands of federal employees. I think there's been a tradition of bipartisan investment in the federal workforce, and things did get very ideological at the beginning of this administration about the workforce. So I appreciate it, and I look forward to
I hope I
working
haven't
with you.
damaged your reputation by saying that.
Nor mine yours. But I do want to comment. For example, there was a bill that we worked with in a bipartisan way in terms of TSP pulling out, that's actually been signed into law under this administration. It was actually one that we had initiated and worked with Chairman Cummings on. Additionally, during this shutdown, I put forth immediately a bill that would have allowed federal workers to pull money out of their TSP accounts without penalty and without cost, to hopefully alleviate some of the pains of missing a paycheck. So it's not lost on me, but I appreciate you raising the points.
Yeah. Mr. Connolly, just one last question for you. You have emphasized 900,000 federal workers are making less than $60,000 a year. And one of the things I think that struck the public during this shutdown crisis was how many federal workers are not in plush, cushy, upper middle class jobs, but are in real working class jobs and are a paycheck away from disaster, which is why this shutdown hit people so severely. And so I wonder if you would just talk about what this legislation means to those people who've been through the shutdown crisis.
Well, it means a real raise. It also, I think, look, it's real dollars. It doesn't solve all of one's financial challenges, but it's a down payment on what Mr. Woodall was talking about earlier, and what I think Mr. Meadows and I will try to find common ground for. But also, in this case, it is important as a message from the people's body to the people's civil servants about where do you rank? How are you held in terms of our esteem? And especially in light of what just happened, which we have to take responsibility for, too. And as you said eloquently, Mr. Raskin, the damage is very real, very real. And people have to put their lives back together. And many people, I watched, as did many others, about certain spokespeople in the cabinet saying they couldn't understand why people would go to food banks. Or they could just, divest themselves of part of their portfolio or take a loan. You take a loan that costs you money you were not budgeted for. And the only reason you're doing that is because we're imposing that because we're not paying you, we, the government. And so I think it's both a real thing in terms of purchasing power and enhancement of paycheck, but it's also a very important message and signal from the Congress. We don't want this to happen again, and this is the beginning of our commitment to making sure that's the case.
Thank you. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for being out. I had one of my school districts in town that I had to speak to before they had to leave. On the issue of, and I think Mr. Woodall mentioned this, and I think I heard Ms. Torres mention it, that could this have been a bipartisan effort? And it seems like it could have. And I guess I just want to underscore what Mr. Woodall related, that I hope that, I mean, you have the votes to do what you're going to do with this bill on the House floor, and I get that. Whether I like the process or not, you're going to do this, but still, I think it's worthwhile. I think it's instructive. I think it's important to go through the hearing process that you apparently didn't have time to do now, because I think there are some legitimate questions that should be brought up and should be answered, and that's, of course, what a hearing does. And I, for one, would be very interested in you putting your efforts together on having that hearing and having testimony, testimony from people who are in favor or opposed to the bill. I mean, that's typically the way we do things. So I just want to very much encourage you to continue that process. Don't let it end with this. I get it. We don't need to reiterate all of the reasons that people have given that this is here before us as we are here today, but it's an important enough topic that I think it deserves a full and formal hearing, and because we know the nature of the other body over there, there's probably not going to be the last word on this. And then just speaking of the other body, and I mean, one of the reasons we've gotten to where we were on some of these things with appropriation lapses, and let's be honest, last year and the year before, the House did its work, went through all the bills, got them done in time before the end of the fiscal year, and got them over to the other body. And the other body decided, because of the 60-vote rule, that we're not going to give this administration anything, and we're going to hold it up. And unfortunately, that has sort of become standard operating procedure. And it's not because Republicans were in charge in the last term of Congress, and I think it's wrong because when Republicans were in charge, that their appropriations bills weren't passed. Look, I get it why people are talking about, well, we don't ever want to be at risk for this happening again, so we're going to do something so it doesn't happen again. And I know there are bills out there, but let me just sound a note of caution. I mean, we are the House of Representatives. We do control the purse strings for the country, and that authority was given to us for good reason. You know, the chairman, remember his delegation, probably back in, what was it, the 80s, during the Reagan administration, Edward Boland had the Boland Amendment. It was a limitation amendment on an omnibus appropriations bill, and it kind of tied Reagan's hands with providing aid to the Sandinistas, and I suspect the Contras.
Yeah. Reagan was supporting the Sandinistas, yeah.
Nevertheless, I mean, the concept was this was a way for Congress to exercise its authority by exercising the power of the purse, and was in fact able to restrict the activities of the administration. I remember when I was in medical school, right after the end of the Vietnam War, the Mayaguez was captured, and Gerald Ford wanted to go in with the full force of the 7th Fleet and take it back, and Congress said, no, you can't do that. And another confrontation or conflagration was avoided. And of course, as I recall, you know, back in my youth, that was the whole story with the ending of the Vietnam War, was limitation on appropriations that was provided when you all took the majority in 2007. I remember Charlie Rangel saying, you know, someone asked him, how are you going to end the Iraq War? He said, we have the power of the purse. And there are plenty of examples in the history where that power has been used. So before we go down the road of saying we're just not going to ever be in this position again, I get why people would say that. I get how hard it has been for everyone. But I do ask for some restraint. I would rather see us clamor for the other body to change its rules and go to a straight-up 51 vote to move an appropriations bill, just as when the Democrats were in charge in 1972 or 74 when they did the budget reform that happened in those years. It's tough to pass a budget, always a reason to vote against a budget, spends too much, doesn't spend enough. So since it's hard to pass a budget, it's only going to take 51 votes in the Senate. I think now the same is true for spending bills. And yes, I get it that the current Senate Majority Leader says, well, when the shoe's on the other foot, we're going to be able to slow things down. I guarantee you, if you all find yourselves with a 2 or 3 vote majority in the other body after the next election, you will change that in a heartbeat. And you should. You should. We shouldn't hold things hostage to that 60-vote rule. In the House, we are strictly a majority on spending bills. It should be that way in the in the other body. I almost misspoke. Is it still a rule that we're not allowed to say the United States Senate?
Anything goes in this committee.
All right. But anyway, that's my piece, and I just wanted to get it off my chest. But I do hope this will not be the end of this discussion that we have.
Certainly not.
I think the hearing is important. I think I've got some questions that I'd really like for perhaps we can follow up, Mr. Meadows, with when you do have that hearing.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I get questions back home. The federal government, yes, that was tough what they just went through. Is the workforce there too big? Are there things that should be done outside the federal? Should we privatize? There was a big argument last Congress about should we privatize air traffic control? I didn't support that, but now I'm asking the question, well, maybe that was something that we should have considered more strongly than we did. So I've got a lot of questions about some of the activities and the size of the federal workforce. I'd hope to be able to get those addressed when you all, in fact, have your hearing, and I hope you call the appropriate witnesses.
Mr. Burgess, I would just say I certainly appreciate the point you made about power of the purse, and you're right in citing some history. With respect to the other body, I am reminded of what a Texan member of this body once said, Sam Rayburn. He said, Republicans are the opposition, but the Senate is the enemy.
And with all of the affection with which I always hold our dearly departed friend from Texas, it was Mr. Rayburn who fixed the size of this committee with 9 in the majority, 4 in the minority, and there we are today.
God bless him.
However, that was the reform from in the Cannon years when the Speaker was the chairman of the Rules Committee, and that was probably uncomfortable on several days as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. And let me just say again, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this. I agree with much of what you said, but especially with regard to process. And look, I mean, in the last Congress, a big chunk of bills came before this committee that never went through committees of jurisdiction, had no hearings, had no markups, it just came here. We criticized that. We want to change that. I mean, you can criticize this process right now, but as Mr. Connolly pointed out, the Committee of Jurisdiction just constituted yesterday. We think this is, I mean, today. We think this is on our side, we think this is an urgent matter that needs to be addressed. But as we move forward, and if it becomes clear that we're not keeping our word in terms of respecting the rules that we put out, I mean, I have no doubt that you will be vocal in criticizing us, as you should be, because again, one of the things that I think we want to do in this committee, on both sides of the aisle, is make this place function, and that means that committees of jurisdiction, when members fight to get on, ought to be able to do their job before it comes here. And my hope is that is the way we proceed. So having said that, let me turn over to Mrs. Scanlon.
I would just add that I found Mr. Connolly's argument persuasive, that we do need to show the federal workers that we have their backs. They've been really suffering under the slings of arrows of hearing that their work isn't valued, hearing that they're not going to get the raise that was supposed to be implemented, and then suffering from the shutdown. So we've certainly had a lot of correspondence in our office from folks who just feel disrespected, and now have credit and bills and all that kind of thing to make up. So with that, I would just support the rule.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the gentleman for what I think has been a fascinating conversation and discussion. I just have a couple of quick questions. I'll use this as a teachable moment for myself. You mentioned the statutory number, 2.1%. Is the statutory number set by, I assume it's not a number, it's driven by a formula? Is that the CPIW, or what's that number?
It is set by a formula. I couldn't tell you what the formula actually totally encompasses, but it's inflation, and the ultimate number also includes the locality adjustment. And Mr. Cole referenced 1.4%, and that is how you get to 1.9. It's 1.4 base and 0.5 locality adjustment, and that's how they get to 1.9.
So there's a regional part to that, is what
so
I was saying.
I can comment on that just a little bit. It's kind of like trying to figure out the lights and the bells that we have. They may have no relevance to
Dear
anything.
Lord, then I'll never learn this then.
But it's actually it's an economic cost index that'll allows for the percentage to be figured.
And it of course looks at metrics in terms of the private sector as well.
Gotcha. So you went through quickly, Mr. Connolly, the numbers of previous years. Could you just walk me through the last 3 or 4 that you mentioned, what the actuals were, and if you had the statutory number?
Yeah, I was comparing what the basic pay raise is for the civilian side versus what the military pay increase. Now, the military pay, and Mr. Meadows is right, we are a little bit comparing apples and oranges because they do have different missions and different pay scales and so forth. That's true. But in the last 10 years, there's never been a pay freeze on the military side. This one would make like the 4th on the civilian pay in that same time period. And consistently, the basic pay raise for the civilian side is, falls legs way behind, well, usually way behind, the military pay increase recommendation. So, as I said, this year, 2.6% in the military, 0 recommended for the civilian, unless we take action. Last year, 2.4% in the military side, 1.4% on the civilian side. 2017, 2.1% in the military side, 1% on the civilian side. 2016, it was closer, 1.3 and 1, respectively. Next year, it was equal, 1%. We had pay parity. And during the Obama years, we tried to have pay parity as a matter of policy. And I'm trying to get back to that.
And I appreciate that. One of the, I guess, part of the question I had was whether or not the statutory increases for the civilian side, setting aside the military for the moment, whether it has been the tradition over the last several years to make sure that the statutory number was met when we actually did the appropriations, and whether or not there's been a lag. You understand what I'm saying?
I would say, looking at it, I can give you the statutory formula for those years I just read.
Yes.
So it's 2% versus 0 recommended. It's 1.8% versus 1.4% recommended. 1.5% versus 1% recommended. 1.7% versus 1% recommended. 1.4 versus 1.
So the actual versus, so we've been lagging behind the statutory requirement for a number of years.
What the statutory formula otherwise would have provided.
Gotcha. And I'll just conclude this way, that for me, this has been a fascinating conversation about retention, attraction, the shutdown impacts. For me, I think fundamentally, when you hire people, and I owned a software business for a better part of a decade, when you hire employees and you agree to pay them in return for their good work, that what you would hope to avoid is the reduction of that pay in terms of purchasing power. And so all the other issues that we talked about, I think, are important and certainly deserve our attention. But for me, fundamentally, it's just fairness here. We want to make sure that the people who choose us as employers and we choose them as employees don't get hurt by the effects of inflation over time, and that's clearly what has happened over the last several years. So to me, this is just fundamentally a fair thing to do, and I'm going to vote for the bill. Would be happy to hear about reforms, and yes, sir.
So I want to be clear, so we make sure the record reflects the action. The gentleman is correct with the percentages, but that's one part of the equation. If you look at the average federal employee salary increase, it has exceeded CPI over the last decade consistently each and every time, and it's part of the reason why the adjustment was down. Many of those were done under the Obama administration, but to suggest that they had less purchasing power is not an accurate reflection of the record.
Well, I appreciate that. I assume, though, that the statute was written as an attempt to make sure that purchasing power was, that you continue to meet purchasing power, and that the steps are reflective of the increased experience and work responsibilities of employees. So I think there's probably, they're looking at the two different dimensions. Notwithstanding that, if the statute has recommended it and we haven't met that target for the last several years, I think this is an opportunity, again, to make sure that people
Right,
get what the statute
and
has
I want to be
required of them.
clear, we didn't talk about purchasing power. We talked about the statutory formula, and we talked about the comparison with the private sector. Are we keeping up or not?
Right. And I
one
just,
talked about-
right, I guess I've injected the idea that I assume the statutory requirements for those increases, which is based on the indexes or the indices that you mentioned, was an attempt by the authors of that original legislation to make sure that
I think that's
personnel
right.
is maintained.
I think that's right.
Thank you.
Mr. Leo.
Thank you very much. I don't want to take any more time. I worry as much about the recruitment of the next generation as I do about retention. And obviously, I've had enough government experience holding on to scientists and other things, and I'm not sure we'll ever be able to get real parity with the private sector and the science at the top levels. But here's what you wouldn't do if we think of ourselves as the employers. Forget about the executive. We're the employers. Here's what you would not do. You would not freeze pay for no economic reason. You would not ask your employees to miss 2 paychecks and then make them work. And you wouldn't make disrespectful comments about your own workers. So I just want to make the point that this is a bigger issue and far more significant than us worrying just about their pay. We've got to worry about how we retain this workforce. They've always assumed, even if you talk to the CDC guys or the FDA people or the NIH people, they've assumed a certain amount of security and professionalism on behalf of those who lead this government. And that requires that we put all the other elements in place. No private sector company could survive if it did all those things to its employees. And so I think the Congress has to step up and think of itself as really being responsible for all of the pieces to retain and recruit a first-class workforce. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to say to you, Mr. Leila, and welcome to this committee and the Congress, no one in this room has more experience in recruitment and retaining a federal agency than, of course, you do. And you speak from great authority and experience, and I take your point exactly right. I worked for 20 years, and I know my friend worked in the private sector as well. I worked for 20 years for 2 corporations before I came here. Had our CEO done what you described, he or she would have been fired within hours by our corporate board for malfeasance. That is not how you manage a private sector, for-profit or non-for-profit company. And yet, we like to say we want to run government like a business. I don't know any business that would run this way. Your point is very well taken. I
Thank you both very much. I appreciate your patience. Oh, wait. Oh, what?
I wonder if I might have one redirect while we have our witnesses here.
Okay.
Does this include employees who are paid under Title 42 exceptions? Since former Secretary Shalala brought up about scientists, there are some that are paid at a rate that is higher than the GS scales in order to recruit and retain those individuals. Are they included in this discussion?
The answer is yes. And I think there may be a couple of amendments that are going to also clarify that.
All right, good.
And just as a point of clarification, and look, I'm not disparaging what a scientist works at NIH earns, but what we have found in our committee is looking into this in a little detail. The Environmental Protection Agency, which began life as an offshoot of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or Health and Human Services, they also pay their employees sometimes under this Title 42 exemption. And what we found was entry-level chemists could be paid at that higher rate. And it had always concerned me that we just allowed that to continue and never really worked on trying to adjust that back somewhere toward normalcy. That is, once it started, then it was impossible to ever go back. And if the pay increases are accumulating on top of that, it just seems to me like we're compounding a problem in some areas. So again, that's why I would welcome the opportunity for you all to have the hearing and look into this, because I think it is important. It does need to be sorted out. And then just for one last thing, when I was in private practice, if I hadn't managed things well enough that there was money at the end of the month, I didn't get paid. And that was always a high motivator for me. And people talk about whether or not members of Congress should be included in this, and I realize there's constitutional reasons why we're not, but it is a profound motivator as the number one person in a company. If you don't make money, you don't take any home. It keeps you focused. That's all I'll say about it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your patience. Leave before there's any more questions. Yeah. Are there any other members who want to testify in this legislation? I don't see anybody, so this closes the hearing portion of the meeting. So at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 790, the Federal Civilian Workforce Pay Raise Fairness Act of 2019, a structure rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed as Part A of the report shall be considered as adopted in the House and in Committee of the Whole, and the bill, as amended, shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part B of the report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report and may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the times specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, and shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the questions. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Finally, Section 2 of the rule provides that it shall be in order at any time through the legislative day of February 8th, 2019, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules as though under Clause 1 of Rule 15, and the Speaker or her designee shall consult with the minority leader or his designee on the designation of any matter for consideration pursuant to this section.
So as we just heard from the gentlelady from California, this rule provides for consideration of H.R. 790, the Federal Civilian Workforce Pay Raise Fairness Act, under a structured rule. This rule self-executes a manager's amendment that strikes Section 3 of the bill and makes technical corrections. This rule also makes in order 3 amendments, each debatable for 10 minutes. It makes in order all germane amendments that we received. Finally, the rule provides suspension authority through next Friday, February 8th. So you've heard the motion. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole? Nothing?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Woodall?
What is this amendment number 3 by Ms. Tran to make sure that the IRS employees are counted as federal employees? Is there some question about whether or not IRS employees would be eligible for an across-the-board raise?
I think it's just a clarification amendment, but I'm sure when it gets debated on the floor, you can get more information from Ms. Trahan, but it's been ruled germane by the parliamentarians, so it's relevant to this bill.
Okay. Well, I'll look forward to finding out what it's all about tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can burden the Rules Committee.
We can get you a copy of the amendment if you'd like. Any other discussion or comment? Okay, so we have hearing none. The question is now on the motion offered from the gentlelady from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole votes no. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko votes no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, will manage this for the majority. And Mr. Woodall will manage for the minority. Okay, and I guess that's it. So without objection, the committee stands adjourned.